Good morning.
Good morning.
Today's passage is going to come from actually two places. It's going to come from Genesis 16, 9 through 15, as well as Genesis 21, 14 through 21. But for the sake of time, I'm going to read part of the focal passage, and that is in Genesis 21, verses 17 and 18.
All right.
And the passage reads, "And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, 'What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation.'" This morning, if you all will indulge me for just a few moments, I'd like to speak to the topic of gone but not forgotten. Hello, my name is Mary, and I'm a recovering addict. For years, I was a reality TV-aholic. It started small with MTV's The Real World, and then I graduated to The Bachelor, The Real Housewives, Flavor of Love, 1, 2, and 3. And I found myself captivated and intrigued by some of the crazy things that these people would do to one another and how they treated each other on these shows. It was exciting to tune in from week to week to see who was going to tell whose business or who was going to get in a fight. But honestly, over time, as I grew and matured, it got a little overplayed. And I started to kind of get a little tired of all the mess. I started to realize that some people would do anything they needed to get their 15 minutes of fame, regardless of how wrong it was or who they had to hurt to do it. And I just couldn't watch anymore. I remember thinking, this is not reality. People don't really act like this. At least the people I know don't really act like this. But I think over time, I've grown to see that maybe in some ways, reality TV is art reflecting life. Human relationships are very complicated. If we look at how our divorce rate in this country has steadily grown over time, the fact that 1 in 4 children report being bullied throughout the school year, the idea that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims of some type of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Honestly, the way that people treat other people is just downright awful sometimes. But you know what? It's nothing new. If we look through scripture, people have been cutting up and acting a fool and messing over each other from the beginning of time. From Cain killing Abel to Noah cursing Ham and Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery. Even when David sent Uriah to the front of the battle lines to be murdered, and when Judas betrayed Jesus. If there's one thing that we as human beings know how to do well, it's mess over somebody. And at some point in our lives, all of us will have to face the ugliness of someone mistreating us. But there's good news, and there's hope for us. And one of the earliest glimpses of this hope within Scripture is the story of an Egyptian slave girl named Hagar. Now, the story of Hagar, Sarah, and Abraham is a prime example of the depths of the complexities of human relationships. And we're all seminarians. We know the story. It starts in Genesis 12, where God calls Abram to leave the house of his father and travel to a land that God will show him, which we later know becomes Canaan. And then there's God's promise, right? God tells Abram that he will make him a great nation, that he'll make his name great, so that he can be a blessing, and that through him, the families of the earth will be blessed. So at 75, Abram packs up all his stuff and he goes. And after traveling for a while, there's yet to be evidence of God's promise, namely children. He doesn't have any descendants after years of kind of being on this journey. And we see in chapter 16 that they run into a little bit of a problem because Sarai, his wife, is barren. And so in chapter 16, Sarah comes to Abram and she says, "Now God has prevented me from having children. So here is my Egyptian slave girl Hagar. Have sex with her and have children on my behalf." And without skipping a beat, Abram's like, "Okay." And I can remember even hearing this as a child in Sunday school and being like, wait. They did what? Because in our culture, this seems really strange and odd. But in the culture of that time, this was normal. In this time, a woman was only valuable if she was an unmarried virgin in her father's house, or if she was a married childbearing woman in her husband's house. So if a woman was barren and she couldn't have children, she was supposed to give her slave or her maidservant to her husband to have children on her behalf. That gave her security, because if she couldn't produce children, she ran the risk of being divorced, and then she really had no place to go. So for Sarah, this is what she was supposed to do given her condition. And she also probably saw that her barrenness was standing in the way of God's promise to Abram. So Sarai gives Hagar to Abram, and Hagar becomes the first surrogate in biblical history. And this right here in the story is where the drama actually really starts. Because now that Hagar is pregnant, her status in the household has been raised. Because now she's carrying the heir. She's carrying the fulfillment of the divine promise. And the text implies that maybe Hagar's new level of importance started to go to her head a little bit. Maybe she started to feel herself a little bit too much. Because it says she started to look at Sarai with contempt. Meaning that she was looking at her like she was less significant. Like they didn't really even need Sarai anymore. And it didn't take long for Sarai to have to step up and kind of put Hagar back in her place. And so she starts to mistreat her and abuse her. And it gets so bad that Hagar runs away. So in chapter 16, we find her alone, scared, wandering in the wilderness pregnant, when the angel of the Lord calls her by name. Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Hagar is the first woman since Eve to have this type of face-to-face interaction with God. And she explains that she's running away. But God tells her, go back to Sarai, knowing that this is probably the only way that she's going to survive. But he promises to multiply her offspring, and he announces to her that she's going to have a boy named Ishmael. When we see how Sarai responds in the text in chapter 16, verse 13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God of seeing, for she said, truly, here I have seen him who looks after me. In the original language, Hagar actually does something that no one else has ever done. She gives God a name. The Hebrew says that she calls him El Rohai, God who sees me. This is so significant because Hagar is a slave. She's a piece of property. She's not a person. She's just something to be used, abused, and discarded. But not to God. He calls her by name, and he sees her as a person, as someone of worth and value, someone that he cares about. He sees her. And Hagar, I remember hearing a testimony of a woman who shared a story of how she had gone through a tough time in her marriage, and she was really looking and depending on God to save what seemed unsavable. She had made a lot of mistakes. She was really struggling. Her husband was struggling to forgive her for some of these things. And she tried to change her behavior towards him. She was trying to be different and trying to love him and care for him and show him how much she was committed to their marriage, but it wasn't really making a difference. His heart was still hardened against her. And one day, as she confided in a close friend of hers, her friend told her, I know that it's hard, and I know that it hurts. And I know that even though it seems like the things that you're doing are in vain, remember that even when your husband doesn't see you, God sees you. And it was that truth from her friend that she was able to hold on to. And any time that she got frustrated or discouraged, she would just take a deep breath. God sees me. And reminding herself of that allowed her to hold on and keep strength and knowing that it was going to be okay. And even though the journey was long and it was hard, over time, God did heal that broken relationship. When we think about how the world really is good at chewing people up and spitting them out, there are actually Hagars all around us. It's that little boy who's been acting out in school, and even though his single mom is doing the best that she can, he's struggling to reconcile and understand all this hurt and anger he feels because in his mind, he wasn't good enough for his dad to stay around. It's that woman who grew up in an abusive household, and she never saw what a healthy relationship was supposed to look like. So when her husband hit her for the first time, she thought it was her fault. And now she finds herself sitting, bloodied and beaten on her bathroom floor, trying to find the courage to leave, but not thinking that she can really survive without him. And it's that young man who signed up to be all he could be. But after 3 tours in Iraq, he returns home and the PTSD is just too much to handle, so he turns to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain. And over time, his friends fade away and family members turn their backs on him. And now he finds himself every day standing on a corner with a sign that says veteran, will work for food. There are Hagars everywhere. And maybe you're in a season in your life where you're feeling devalued and unappreciated and alone. Maybe someone has abandoned you or betrayed you and you feel forgotten. I want you to be encouraged today and not lose hope. Because even when it seems bad, God sees you. As we return to our story, Hagar does go back to Sarah and Abram, and she gives birth to Ishmael. And about 13 years go by. Sarah and Abram are now Abraham and Sarah, and God has performed a miracle. He has allowed Sarah in her old age and her barren state to conceive and bear a son named Isaac. And one day Sarah tells Abram, that Egyptian woman and her son are not going to share as heirs with my son. So you need to get rid of them. And this is hard for Abraham. Because even though Sarah had never accepted Ishmael as her son, he had always seen him as his son, and he loved him as such. So even though Abraham was troubled by this, God spoke to him and reassured him that Ishmael was going to be okay, that he was still going to make a nation out of him because he was Abraham's son. So Abraham waits until the next morning, gets up pretty early, probably before Sarah is awake. He takes Ishmael and Hagar, gives them a little bread, a little water, and then he sends them into the desert of Beersheba. Hagar and Ishmael are on their own, cast out to fend for themselves. And when we look in chapter 21 at verse 15, we see they've run out of water, and things are not looking well for Ishmael. We aren't told exactly how long they were out there, but it takes about 10 days for someone to die of dehydration. So for days, they've been wandering. And even though she's weak herself, for days she's just watched her son, her only child, get weaker and weaker and weaker. His skin is dry. His lips are chapped. His eyes are sunken in. He's probably starting to stumble around a little bit disoriented. And then Hagar finds a bush. And she leads Ishmael over and lets him lie down in the shade. I can see her kneeling down to carefully stroke his hair, trying to make him as comfortable as possible given the circumstances. And with tears welling up in her eyes, she leans over to kiss her son on the forehead and tell him for one last time, I love you. Then she rises and finds a spot across from him about 50 yards away, not too far so that she can't keep watch, but far enough that she won't have to sit there and watch her child take his last breath. And then she falls apart, sobbing and crying, just this inner anguish that she feels. Not only has she had to endure years of just mistreatment and an abuse from Sarah, but in a blink of an eye, everything she knew, everything she had was gone. Her family, her home, everything. And she was cast out and abandoned, and now she had to endure the gut-wrenching pain of watching her child die and not being able to do anything to prevent it. But that's not the end of the story. When we look in chapter 21 at verse 17, and God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. So not only has God seen them, but God heard them. He heard the faint whimperings of Ishmael as he lay there about to die and the heartbreaking cries of Hagar. They had been cast out. They weren't part of Abraham and Sarah's house. They were gone from that situation, but they were not forgotten. God heard them. And God hears us. He hears our prayers. He hears our thoughts. He hears us when the pain of our situation is so heavy on our souls that it's suffocating us to the point where we can't speak. And when we can't even lift up our voices to pray, when all we can do is sit and cry and moan, God hears that too. And that's not even the best part, because it is comforting and reassuring that we serve a God who hears us and who sees us, but we don't serve a passive God. We also serve a God who delivers. I first became aware of some of the atrocities of human trafficking a few years ago. And we tend to think of slavery as something that's past tense. But even now in 2016, there are 20 to 30 million men, women, and children who are in the global slave trade right now. These people are exploited and abused, and when their usefulness expires, they're thrown out like trash. Last year, I had an opportunity to hear Christine Kane speak. And if you don't know who she is a pretty well-known Bible teacher and conference speaker. But she and her husband founded an organization called A21 that focuses on trying to abolish slavery in the 21st century. And so at this event, she shared a lot of stories about some of the different trafficking victims they have been able to rescue. And she shared a story about how one day they were feeling really moved to ask people to pray for trafficking victims in the Stan countries, like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. And there were two girls, twin sisters in Uzbekistan, who had been trafficked for over a year. So for over a year, every day they were beaten, abused, and raped by several men. And for that whole year, they had been praying each day to Allah, but nothing had happened. And then one day out of nowhere, one of the sisters remembered hearing someone talk about this God of Europe. And she thought she remembered they called him Jesus. So that day, for the first time, she took her sister's hands and they prayed to Jesus to rescue them from their traffickers. 2 days later, the brothel they were in was raided and the girls were rescued. And when they were in the A21 safe house talking to the workers, they realized that the day that the girls started praying to Jesus was the exact same day they sent out that global prayer request. Because not only do we serve a God that hears, we serve a God who delivers. And so when we see what is happening with Hagar and Ishmael, in the midst of their affliction, God heard Ishmael's cry and he delivered them. In verse 19 of chapter 21, it says, "Then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy and he grew up." Not only did God provide water to save Ishmael in that moment, but he was with him, meaning that he continued to protect him and to provide for him over time. And Ishmael went on to have 12 sons. And these sons became the chiefs of the Arab nations that are still around today. He made nations of him just like he said he was going to. We're all going to find ourselves in situations where people have mistreated us and lied on us and betrayed us and abandoned us. But even when we're in our lowest, most hopeless moments, God knows our situations, and he can deliver us from any circumstance. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. If you're going through something, I want you to know, hold on, because you're not forgotten. God's got it, and he's got you. God sees, God hears, and God delivers. And if you're in a place where you feel like, well, as a believer, I shouldn't have to go through tough stuff, just know that when we have problems, we're in good company. Because there was a Nazarene man one time who was despised and denied and discarded. He was rejected in his own hometown. He was betrayed by someone in his inner circle. And he was denied 3 times by his most faithful follower. He was beaten, he was broken, and he was killed on a cross. But after 3 days, he rose with all power and might in his hands so that we could be saved by his blood and set free. And I don't know what problems you're facing, but I know who can solve them. And his name is Jesus. Yeah. God sees you, God hears you, and God will deliver you. Praise God.